I realize that conditions are difficult for Dr. Teng and his students in Shanghai, and I hope that, as Dr. Teng said, that perhaps some of you may find at least some ideas from ancient philosophy and Pierre Hadot's revival of ancient philosophy that may, in some way, in some minor way, be useful to you as you confront your difficult situations. So, Pierre Hadot. Pierre Hadot, we owe to Pierre Hadot, as Professor Teng said, Dr. Teng said, the idea of philosophy as a way of life. And basically, as he also said, this is the notion that philosophy in Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, was not so much the way it is today, a matter of publishing articles and writing books and so forth, but it was a way of life. It was not an intellectual pastime like trying to solve a crossword puzzle, but a system in which, as Pierre Hadot said, the goal was to raise the individual from an inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness and harassed by worry, to an authentic state of life in which she attains self-awareness, an exact vision of the world, inner peace, and freedom. And as the quote reads here, speaking more specifically about the Stoic spiritual exercises and philosophy as a way of life, for the Stoics, each instant and each present moment imply the entire universe. By becoming conscious of one single instant of our lives, one single beat of our hearts, we can feel ourselves linked to the entire immensity of the cosmos. The whole universe is present in each part of reality. So, some of the assumptions of Pierre Hadot's methodology of the study of ancient philosophy. Ancient philosophy was primarily a way of life, as we have seen, and its goal was to transform the philosopher by changing the perspective from which they view reality, enabling them to live a life that is more free, autonomous, intense, and happy. In Hadot's words, as he writes in one of his books, The Inner Citadel, the goal was to live in complete consciousness and lucidity, to give each of our instants its fullest intensity, and to give meaning to our entire life. So, more specifically, what Hadot recommended was, on the basis of a close philological study of ancient texts in Greek and Latin, taking account of their historical, social, and literary context, Hadot sought to discover how ancient philosophy might be relevant to the way that we live today. Not because it provides solutions to our philosophical problems, but because it can provide us with guidelines on how to transform ourselves. Hadot believed that by learning to see the world in a different way, we can make ourselves better. And in fact, he goes so far as to say we can make ourselves live and exist more intensely. And this is what has been called Pierre Hadot's ethical perfectionism. And the means towards this goal was what Hadot called spiritual exercises. So spiritual exercises, what are they? Well, in ancient Greece and Rome, especially in Greece, the difference between the thoughts that we have and the ideas that we express was not that great. The only difference between thought and dialogue is that thought is quiet and dialogue is expressed. According to ancient Greek philosophy, we're constantly talking to ourselves. We're constantly carrying out a dialogue with ourselves. And now, just as rhetoric in ancient Greece and Rome was the art of structuring our external speech in order to be more persuasive to our listeners, so spiritual exercises were the art of structuring our inner discourse, the way we talk to ourselves, so that instead of allowing ourselves to be buffeted by chaotic waves, by incoming thoughts, we were to be able to control our thoughts. So what counts as a spiritual exercise is not so much the nature of the activity as how it is undertaken. That is to say, its attitude, its methods, and its goals. All spiritual exercises require complete attention to and focus upon an activity. and they imply that we immerse ourselves so completely in what we're studying that we forget ourselves, or at least we forget our everyday phenomenal self, in what Csikszentmihalyi has called a flow experience. But it's not just any kind of a flow experience, I would argue. It's an activity in which one engages with the intent of carrying out some kind of transformative action upon oneself. Now, one of the key bases of this methodology is that we are to base our thoughts and actions on a few easily memorizable formulas that are to be meditated on constantly. And these are formulas that sort of summarize the essence of the doctrines of the philosophical school to which we belong. For instance, in the case of Stoics, there would be formulas like, it's not so much things that harm us as the attitude toward things. The main distinction between what depends on us, the rectitude of our moral intentions, versus what does not depend on us, what the Stoics called indifference, like health, wealth, good looks, even life itself. These are things that do not depend on us, and we must not worry too much about them. Other ideas that had to be meditated on include the fact that moral intentions are all that matters. The only good is the moral good, and the only evil is moral evil. So, some spiritual exercises listed by Hadot include research, listening, attention, self-mastery, indifference to indifferent things, and so forth and so on. I won't read the whole list. When it comes to physical definition, what's meant by that is that sometimes when we're faced with difficulties, we're overwhelmed by their sheer mass, the sheer number of difficulties that we have, that we're faced by. And the idea is that if we define them, if we break down these problems into their component parts, one by one, and concentrate on the parts, we find that we can deal with each of the parts individually, one by one by one. And then we cease to be so completely overwhelmed by the problems bearing down on us. Another spiritual exercise was the art of living in and concentrating on the present. The idea behind this is that a lot of our worries, a lot of our suffering is caused partly by regrets about the past and partly by worries about the future. But according to the Stoics, neither the past nor the present exists. The only thing that really exists, the only thing on which we can act and in which we can exercise our freedom, is the present. And by the same token, by concentrating on the present, we can come to see the beauty of existence. As Hadot writes in his last book, which is currently in press and should soon be published, by concentrating on the present, consciousness, far from shrinking, raises itself to a higher viewpoint, from which one sees in a way the past and the future in the present, and it opens up to the infinity and eternity of being. So the idea here is that such exercises were ideal means for achieving something called cosmic consciousness. What is meant by cosmic consciousness? Well, Hadot gives several definitions of it. One is the consciousness that we are part of the cosmos, and the consequent dilation or expansion of the self throughout the infinity of universal nature. The French scholar of religions, Michel Hulin, wrote that this feeling is akin to the feeling of an essential co-belonging between myself and the surrounding universe. What it means is to see things from the perspective of the whole, or the all, or the totality, rather than doing what we usually do, which is looking at life from our isolated, individualistic perspective. So, some key elements of cosmic consciousness: identifying with or consenting to nature or universal reason, which in Greek is called the logos. We'll return to this idea. The basic meaning of it is reason. So the idea is that here we train to live, that is to live consciously and freely by going beyond the limits of individuality to recognize ourselves as part of a cosmos animated by reason. Another key element in cosmic consciousness is the notion of universality or objectivity. Hadot writes that within each school, philosophy signified the attempt to raise up mankind from individuality and particularity to universality and objectivity. A very important spiritual exercise, Pierre Hadot called the view from above. And in this exercise, one imagines oneself floating up above one's existence. For instance, I'm in my basement here in Victoria, Canada. I would imagine myself floating up above the top of my house until I can see my city block, the whole of my city, further still until I see the totality of Vancouver Island, where I'm located right now, and then my province, British Columbia, and then my country, Canada, North America, and finally until I can see the entire Earth. And I can keep on going as far out into the cosmos as I want. The idea being that when one shifts perspective in this way, one looks down on Earth and sees what Seneca calls people scurrying about like ants, and one sees that perhaps what the problems that were overwhelming us in our day-to-day life, when we look at it from above, we can relativize them and put them back in perspective. And this is what Plato is talking about in the Republic when he says, that soul to which pertain greatness of thought and the contemplation of the totality of being and time, do you think it can consider human life to be a matter of great importance? Hence, such a person will not suppose death to be terrible. And similarly, the Neoplatonist Plotinus writes that the Earth is like a point, even when compared to one of the stars. Now, the idea in Platonism and Neoplatonism is that this attitude can give rise to greatness of soul, megalopsychia, which precisely means not placing excessive importance on one's individual existence, relativizing. One of Pierre Hadot's favorite authors was the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from 161 to 180 BC, and he was rather special as Roman emperors go because he was a philosopher. And we know this because he wrote the Meditations. Here we find him writing, watch and see the courses of the stars as if you were running alongside them. When you are reasoning about mankind, look upon earthly things below as if from some vantage point above them. So this view, this exercise, spiritual exercise of the view from above, has a couple of main aspects. It has a cosmic aspect in which this exercise consists in viewing all things from the perspective of the great laws of nature. And here we are to observe the constant transformation of one thing into another, the living unity of the cosmos, and the harmony and in correspondence of all things to one another. There are also therapeutic aspects because philosophy, like medicine, was in this tradition was considered to be therapeutic. It was capable of curing us in some sense. So the therapeutic aspect of the view from above is that it allows us, as we've said, to relativize human reality from the viewpoint of the entire cosmos. When we look at things, when we look at our lives from high above in our imagination, our problems may come to seem a little bit less serious. And what the Stoics called the indifferents, like health, glory, wealth, and death, no longer seem to be quite so important in the global scheme of things. So the main goal from this perspective would be to realize that we are part of a series of concentric circles. The circles of reason, the circles of the human race, the circles of the earth, the circles of the human universe, of the universe as a whole. And here is where another spiritual exercise comes in the dialogue called the Phaedo. Plato makes a very famous and controversial definition of philosophy as learning to die. But this must not be taken literally. Plato doesn't mean that we should go out and kill ourselves. What he means is that the practitioner must die to her individualities and passions in order to look at things from the perspective of universality and objectivity. Let's take a closer look for just a second at Marcus Aurelius' conception of philosophy. Now, the Stoics divided philosophy into logic, ethics, and physics. But Pierre Hadot argues that this division actually really applies only to talk about philosophy. When it comes to doing philosophy, that's a unified act, all of the parts of which imply one another. And here we find that there's a lived logic, a lived ethics, and a lived physics. For instance, logic is the discipline of thought. When we're in the classroom, when we're talking about philosophy, then we study the laws of thought. We study logic. But when we're living, when we get outside the classroom, What logic consists in then is seeing things objectively, analyzing our presentations and our ideas, and withholding our assent from them until we've really carried out a very close evaluation of what is true and what is false. Likewise, when we're in the classroom and we're studying ethics in the discipline of action, then what we do is we make lists and we study lists of classifications of virtues and vices. But when we step outside the classroom, what we do is we accomplish our duties as citizens and we act in the service of the community. Finally, in the discipline of desire, which corresponds to physics, inside the classroom, we study the laws of nature. But once we get outside the classroom, we practice lived physics, experienced physics. And there, the point is to see ourselves as a part of the cosmos, accepting what happens because it's been decreed by the Logos, reason. And here's an example from Marcus Aurelius. He writes that everywhere and at all times, it is up to you to rejoice piously at what is occurring in the present moment. This is the exercise of lived physics. To conduct yourself with justice toward the people who are present here and now, exercise of lived ethics. And finally, to apply the rules of discernment to your present representations so that nothing slips in that is not objective. And this is what Pierre Hadot calls the exercise of lived logic. So, in a nutshell, that's what Pierre Hadot maintains the ancients believed, ancient Greek and Roman philosophers believed. But can we still identify with the cosmos? Is identification with the rational cosmos, which Hadot considered to be a key presupposition, and precondition for philosophy as a way of life, is that still possible today in the 21st century? Well, we've talked a little bit about the Logos. What is meant by that? Well, in Stoic philosophy, the divine principle, which permeates every aspect of reality, was the Logos. And it could also be called, without any difference of meaning, fate, nature, or Zeus, the main god in the Roman pantheon, Greco-Roman pantheon. But it really was equivalent to the series of causes and effects that determine every event. And it was also consubstantial. It had the same essence or substance as our own rational faculty, which constitutes that which makes us human, according to the Stoics. So another key idea in ancient thought was the analogy between the macrocosm and the microcosm. The macrocosm literally meaning makros cosmos in Greek means the large world, the large universe. Mikros cosmos means the small world. So the idea is that there's an analogy between the large scale world and ourselves, our bodies and our minds. Back in the Timaeus of Plato, he writes that the motions that have an affinity to the divine part within us are the thoughts and revolutions of the universe. We should redirect the revolutions in our heads that were thrown off course at our birth by coming to learn the harmonies and evolutions of the universe. So the idea here is that by contemplating the movements of the heaven and the invisible eternal laws that are manifested by these movements, we can sort of make our mind correspond to these movements. We can set our own minds in order by making them correspond to the harmonic movements of the universe. The French scholar André-Jean Festugère wrote the following about philosophy and religion in the Hellenistic period. The god of the Hellenistic stage, he said, is essentially a god of the world. Mankind, for the Hellenistic sage, is essentially a part of the world, which cannot be considered for an instant as detached from this totality. Mankind is defined essentially as a part of the whole, and what counts, above all, is the whole. For unlike modern conceptions, this whole itself is considered to be a living being. So, in ancient Greco-Roman thought, for Plato and Aristotle, for instance, not only is the sun, the moon, and all the planets considered to be perfect living beings, but the entire universe as a whole is considered to be alive. And one might compare in contemporary scientific thought the Gaia hypothesis, which on some interpretations also considers the universe to be alive, or the earth to be alive in some sense. Now, of course, there are differences, important differences, between ancient and modern cosmology, between ancient modern conceptions of what the universe is, how the universe is structured. For the ancients, according to the Ptolemaic system, we have the Earth remaining motionless at the very center of the universe. And it's at the center of this series of concentric crystalline spheres, each of which carries one of the planets. And then at the very extremity here, we have the sphere of the fixed stars. Now, we don't believe that anymore. Nicholas Copernicus in the late 15th and early 16th century revived a hypothesis of the Greek astronomer Aristarchus of Samos and suggested that in fact it's the Earth that is the center of it's the sun, I'm sorry, that's at the center of our cosmos, and the Earth is just one planet among many revolving around it. And many historians assume that this discovery was very traumatic, was very distressing for human beings. All of a sudden, we realize that we are not at the center of the universe. I think this is a questionable idea because when you have a geocentric universe, sure, in one sense, the Earth is at the center of the universe, but in another sense, it's also at the bottom of the universe. It's the planet that is the farthest away of all the planets from the perfection of the celestial realm. And Galileo, who took up and defended and refined the ideas of Copernicus, was perfectly aware of this. When he was justifying his radical new hypothesis, for which he got in trouble, of course, he wrote that the heliocentric view he promoted makes the Earth movable and surpassing the moon in brightness, but not the sewer of the filth and dregs of the world. So, in other words, if the Earth is really right at the bottom of the cosmos, then it collects all the filth that pours down from the rest of the universe. And Galileo says that's not the way things are. In fact, the Earth moves, and so it's not the bottom of the universe anymore. Well, today, as the study of cosmology advances, we believe that the Earth is no longer at the center of the universe, like Galileo and Copernicus, but now we think it's just a marginal planet in a marginal galaxy. Current studies seem to show that the known universe consists of approximately 100 billion galaxies, one of which is our Milky Way, and each of these galaxies contains roughly 100 billion stars, of which the sun, is only one of them, a pretty average-sized star. Our solar system orbits around this average star, the sun, which is, as I said, just one of the 100 billion stars contained in the Milky Way galaxy. And the Milky Way galaxy, in its turn, is a normal spiral galaxy located in the local group of galaxies, which is located on the outskirts of the Virgo supercluster, which in turn is part of the larger Laniakea superculture. This is what we have an illustration here on the cover of Nature magazine of the Laniakea supercluster, and we are approximately where the arrow points, that tiny, tiny little invisible spot in this massive, massive structure. So in contemporary science, these vast cosmic distances are usually thought to be totally foreign and unrelated to us. We, like all living beings, are considered to be mere accidents in this scheme of things. For example, one of the leading cosmologists and popularizers of physics, Sean Carroll, writes that the universe doesn't care about us. The universe doesn't care what we do. It functions according to impersonal and uncaring laws of nature. It doesn't provide guidance. It doesn't know or care about what ought to happen. And Hadot is well aware of this problem. The challenge that this raises for his idea that we can actually reactivate, to a certain extent, ancient Greco-Roman ideas today. Hadot writes that according to a more or less universal tendency of modern thought, the ideas of universal reason and universal nature do not have much meaning anymore. Today, Hadot writes, nature is nothing more for us than man's environment. She has become a purely human problem. The idea of universal reason, the logos, doesn't make much sense anymore. So that's the challenge that we're faced with if we're interested in reactualizing ancient philosophy to make it relevant to our lives today? How can we relate to, much less feel identity with, this vast impersonal structure of the universe, as the Stoics recommended? How can we achieve the kind of cosmic consciousness Haddo spoke about, in which we become aware that we are an integral part of the universe? Can we still, like the Stoics did, live in the constant presence of the universal reason, which is immanent within the cosmos, and see all things from the perspective of this reason and consent joyfully to its will? Because the presupposition of the Stoics, the reason that we can consent to everything that happens to us, even the things that are apparently very bad, very negative, very painful, is that everything is planned by this benevolent, providential reason that permeates the entire cosmos, and that is, in some sense, identical with ourselves, our true selves. So when bad things happen, there's a real sense for the Stoics in which we ourselves have ordained these bad things to happen to us. So what possible solutions can there be to these problems? Well, one that Pierre Haddo mentions has to do with the notion of nature as natura naturans. That is to say, nature that carries out a creative activity. Yeah, it's as opposed to natura naturata, which means nature as already created, already existing objectively. So here the emphasis is on nature as a creative process, not the end result of the process. So Haddo argues that if we don't want or are unable to believe in the Stoic idea of a providential reason penetrating the cosmos, we could try using aesthetic experience to achieve cosmic consciousness and objectivity. Henri Bergson, for instance, argued that artists are naturally detached. They look at the world and what it contains, not as a function of their own interests, the usefulness the world may have for us, but they look at the world in and of itself as something that has intrinsic independent value. And now Haddo says that, like cosmic consciousness, this disinterested aesthetic perception can be brought about by concentration on the present moment, which can give us a more objective view of reality. And here his ideas, this idea that aesthetic perception is linked to the notion of disinterestedness, is also very akin to the kind of things that Immanuel Kant set forth. Here are a couple of examples of this idea of natura naturans, nature is creative. The painter Paul Klee wrote that for the artist, as she imitates the creative work of God, natura naturans is more important than natura naturata. And here he's echoed by the French physicist Bernard d'Espagna, who wrote that the notion of nature as natura naturans, nature as a creative process, as opposed to natura naturata, nature as an already existing, already created, objectively existing thing, may be one of the least inadequate for designating ultimate reality, according to the findings of contemporary science. Another possible aspect, which may lead us to believe that perhaps we're not quite as separated from the universe as we're usually told, the idea that we are stardust. Now, the atoms that we're made up of, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, sulfur, all of them were synthesized inside the stars. So when stars with a mass of at least 8 times our sun run out of their hydrogen and fuel, they collapse and are blasted out into space in what's called a supernova. And the cosmic dust that's formed in this way continues to fall to the Earth at the rate of about 40,000 tons a year. Second, we might want to take into consideration a certain number of correspondences, analogies, resemblances, similarities, which might perfectly well be pure coincidences. Then again, maybe not. So for instance, we've seen that the known universe contains about 100 billion galaxies, each of which contains about 100 billion stars. Now, Sean Carroll, this hard-headed naturalist, reductionist scientist, writes that the number 100 billion is also a very rough count of the number of neurons in a human brain. Okay, maybe that's just a coincidence. Others have pointed out that the large scale structure of the universe exhibits thick clusters of galaxies linked together by long, thin, filament-like clusters of galaxies, and that some have likened this picture to one of brain neurons interconnected by synapses. A couple of illustrations of this, of the macrocosm and the microcosm, the large universe and the small universe. On the left, we have an illustration of the model of the distribution of some of the 100 billion galaxies in the known universe. And on the right, we have just one neuron of the 100 billion neurons that make up our brain. So there seems to be some big kind of structural analogy here, similarity between existence, the world, on the very, very largest scale imaginable, structure of galaxies, and on one of the smallest scales imaginable, the neurons that make up our brain. Here's another example of the same phenomenon. On the left, we have 3 neurons from a mouse brain, and on the right, we have another image of the distribution of galaxies in the visible universe. As we can see, basically the same, or at least a very analogous structure, long filamental structures connecting what one could call nodes or points of connection. Another instance of the large and the small of it. On the left, we have a photograph of a supernova explosion from Nova Cygni in 1992, located 5,500 light years away from us. So that's pretty far away. That's the large aspect, the macrocosmic aspect of the matter. On the right, we have a photograph of a Z ring formed by the protein FTSZ during cell division of E. coli. And we can see once again that there is what seems to be some kind of a structural resemblance between the very, very large and the very, very small in this universe. So maybe, as I said, perfectly possible that these are just coincidences with no significance, but perhaps not. Now, I want to go back to Sean Carroll. He writes that the brain exhibits a structure in which neurons are connected into groups, which are connected into bigger groups, which are connected into even larger groups. So it's a structure that is hierarchical and, in a sense, fractal. It looks the same at whatever scale we look at it. However close we want to zoom into it, we find basically the same, or at least analogous, structures. Carroll goes on to remark that systems of this kind of hierarchical behavior are at a critical point. Now, in physics, systems are said to reach a critical point right before they undergo a phase transition from one phase of orderly behavior to another, which is characterized by chaotic behavior. And this notion of phase transitions, I find interesting because, first of all, it's an important concept in current cosmology. In the view according to which the universe arose to the Big Bang, phase transitions play a crucial role in this process. And way back in the 6th and 5th centuries of our era, when there were debates about the creation of the world, a Christian philosopher like John Philoponus also spoke about the world being created by means of phase transitions. Now, for the contemporary complexity theorist pair Back, this structure of the universe, of many small clusters and a few large ones, indicate, as we've seen, that it's poised in a state of self-organized criticality. Now, the theoretical biologist Stuart Kauffman writes that many systems, from ecosystems to economies to the biosphere as a whole, may evolve to a state that he calls the edge of chaos. By that he means the state between order and chaos, at which interesting things begin to happen. And as we've seen, it's been argued that both our universe and the brain might be in this state at the edge of chaos. So, on this hypothesis, the similarity in structure between the brain on the microcosmic level and the universe on the macrocosmic level might conceivably be explicable by the fact that both have evolved to the edge of chaos. So what would ancient philosophers have said about these apparent similarities in structure between the very, very small and the very, very large, if they had well, of course they did not, but if they had the technical capabilities of perceiving these things? Well, they probably would not have considered these similarities in structure between the brain and the universe to be coincidental. Instead, they would have understood these similarities as a confirmation of their belief in the fundamental connectedness of all realities and of the similarities between the microcosm and the macrocosm. This idea of man as a microcosm goes back to the pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus, and a few centuries later, the Alexandrian philosopher Philo wrote that thus some men have felt confidence even to declare that the smallest of animals, man, is equal to the whole world, considering that each of them consists in a body and a rational soul, so that varying their expression they have called man a little world, mikros kosmos, and the world a large man, makros kosmos. And around the same time as Philo, the astronomer Manilius explains that it's quite understandable that we should be able to know the world. What wonder that human beings can understand the world, he says, when there is a world within them, and each of us is a copy of a God in a smaller image. Now, so we've seen that modern science agrees that we're made up of the same basic elements of the universe, elements that are synthesized within the stars. Although modern science now identifies those elements that we're made up in, not with earth, air, fire, and water as the ancients did, but with carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, and sulfur, and so on. So I just want to come back now to the ideas of the very important thinker, Stuart Kauffman. He writes that in several of the books that he's written, At Home in the Universe, Reinventing the Sacred, Humanity in a Creative Universe. Stuart Kauffman writes that jointly, we and nature create reality. And he also says that I advocate that we rename God, not as the generator, not as the creator of the universe, but as the creativity of the natural universe itself. So here we are back to the divine creative aspect of the universe as natura naturans, rather than natura naturata. And now Kauffman believes, perhaps rather optimistically, that some of the problems, the struggles and the wars between faiths today might be able to be solved if somehow or another all humanity could come to believe in the divinity of nature itself. And Kauffman also wants to fight against what he sees as a tendency in contemporary science, which considers evolution to be just a blind watchmaker, in the terms of Richard Dawkins, and which has, and this viewpoint has as a result the idea that our presence on Earth, the presence of human beings and the presence of life itself is just an accident. Well, Kauffman disagrees. He writes that human beings and other life forms, far from originating in some highly unlikely accident and evolving on the basis of random selection alone, are, and I quote, natural expressions of matter and energy coupled together in non-equilibrium systems. If life in its abundance were bound to arise, not as an incalculably improbable accident, but as an expected fulfillment of the natural order, then we are at home in the universe. We're not strangers. We're not guests. This is our home, and we belong here. In a newly envisioned universe, Kauffman writes, biosphere, and human culture of unending creativity, where life, agency, meaning, value, doing, and consciousness have emerged, and that we co-create, we can now see ourselves meaning-laden as integral parts of emergent nature. And we've been talking, Stuart Kauffman was trained as a biologist. He was also a doctor. But we can find the same tendency in the writings of some physicists. For example, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who was one of the most eminent German physicists, a student and collaborator of Werner Heisenberg, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. Von Weizsäcker wrote that isolation, the idea that we might be isolated or that anything in the universe might be isolated, is just an illusion. He writes that, and I quote, "The isolation of individual objects is, in the eyes of quantum theory, always an approximation. It is never legitimate to describe any object in the world whatsoever as an isolated one." And elsewhere he writes that, quote, "The concept of an isolated object is only an approximation, and according to quantum theory, it is a very bad one." So, scientific findings and cosmic consciousness. We've found so far that contemporary physics and biology combine to suggest that we are made of materials produced by the stars themselves. The universe, on the largest scales, exhibits analogies with the structure of our brains. Our existence may be the quasi-inevitable fulfillment of the natural order, and we are co-creators of the universe. So, to conclude, although we may no longer be able to espouse the Stoic view that the entire universe is ruled by a rational principle, congruent with our own rationality, I would argue that these recent scientific findings can reinforce the ancient idea that we are not totally unrelated to the cosmos, and that we can attempt to resituate ourselves within the context of the universe, realizing that we are akin to it and a part of it. It follows, I think, that the ancient spiritual exercise of shifting attention away from our isolated nature as individuals and our egocentric worries and fears, and realizing that we are parts of a larger whole, may still maintain its therapeutic value, may still help us out when times get tough and we have difficult situations to face. So, suitably updated, the ancient spiritual exercises that constituted the backbone of ancient philosophy as a way of life may still be able to help us relativize our own problems and gaze in the direction in astonishment at the world, as if we were seeing it for the very first time, like a new spectator, tanquam spectator novus. Thank you very much for your attention.